A stone stands on a farm called Galtaland in Norway. It was raised in the 11th century around 1020. A man named Arnstein put it there for his son Bjor. The runes carved into it tell a simple, sad story. Bjor died while serving in the army of King Canute the Great. Canute was attacking England at the time. Bjor wasn't a famous raider leading a charge. He was a skipari, a ship's crewman. It was a common job for a young man trying to earn a living. He pulled ropes, he baled water, he patched sails. He died doing his job far from home. His father's memorial doesn't speak of glory. It just speaks of a son lost in a war. This was the reality for many. The Viking Age was not just about raiding, it was about work. It was about the thousands of Bjors who did their jobs, some strange, some mundane, all necessary. Their stories are quieter, but they are the real story of that time. Number 17, the thrall was the engine of the farm. Catil woke before the sun. The air in the small outbuilding was cold and smelled of damp earth and smoke. He was a thrall. His parents were thralls. He was born on this farm in the Skagafjord of Iceland around the year 980. His world was the farm. His master was a man named Thorolf, a landowner with a large family and many animals. Catil's job was everything Thorolf's family did not want to do. His first task was always the same. He went to the longhouse kitchen. There, he took his place at the quernstone. This was a large, flat stone with another heavier stone on top. He poured barley into a hole in the top stone and began to turn it. The grinding was slow, hard work. It took hours to make enough flour for the day's bread and porridge. His shoulders ached, his hands were calloused. The sound of stone on stone was the first sound of the morning. He did not eat with the family. He ate his portion of porridge, usually thin and plain, in the kitchen or back in his hut. After that, the real work began. In the winter, his main job was the byre. This was the long, low building where the cattle and sheep were kept. The smell was overpowering. He spent his days, mucking out the stalls, spreading fresh hay, and carrying water from the well. The animals were the farm's wealth. Keeping them alive through the harsh Icelandic winter was crucial. He felt the cold seep into his bones. His clothes were coarse wool, often damp. In the spring, his work changed. He helped clear the fields of stones. The volcanic soil of Iceland was full of them. It was back-breaking labor. He followed the master or one of his sons as they used an ard, a simple plow, to break the soil. Ketil's job was to guide the ox or to clear away debris. And he helped sow the barley and rye. He knew the rhythm of the seasons because his work depended on it. Summer was the busiest time. He had to cut peat from the bogs. This was the farm's fuel for cooking and heating. He would slice it into bricks with a special spade and stack it to dry in the wind. He helped with the haymaking. The short growing season meant they had to work fast. Everyone worked, but thralls like Catil worked the longest. And he mended stone walls that kept the sheep from wandering. He repaired turf roofs on the outbuildings. He was a carpenter, a mason, a laborer. He was whatever the farm needed him to be. His status was clear. He owned nothing. He could not leave the farm. He could not marry without his master's permission. His children would also be thralls. He saw the master's family with their silver brooches and fine clothes. He saw the weapons they carried. His life was different. His value was in his labor. Archaeology tells this story without words. At farm sites like Stong in Iceland, which was buried by a volcanic eruption in 1104, we see the layout of this life. There is a large central longhouse for the family. Then there are smaller, simpler structures nearby. And these were likely for the thralls. The tools found are simple and functional iron sickles, scythes, woodworking tools. The quernstones are always there, a silent testament to the daily grind. Slavery was a part of the Norse world. People became thralls through capture in raids, through debt, or by being born to a thrall. The law codes, like the Norwegian Gulating law, had specific rules about them. A master could kill his thrall without punishment, but there was also a path to freedom. A thrall could be manumitted or freed by a master. Sometimes a thrall could even buy their own freedom if they were allowed to earn a small amount of money. But for Ketil, this was a distant dream. His reality was work. His job was to be the power that ran the farm, unseen and uncelebrated. He was not a raider. He was the person who grew the food that fed the raider. Number 16, the Brewster crafted more than just ale. Astrid stood over a large wooden vat in a corner of the longhouse. The air was thick with the sweet, malty smell of boiling grain. It was around 950 AD in a settlement near the coast of Denmark. Astrid was the wife of a farmer named Leif, but one of her most important jobs was that of the brewster. Her ale was not just a drink, it was food. It was a part of every feast, every religious ceremony, every contract sealed between men. A household that made good ale had honor. Her work started days earlier. She had taken sacks of barley and spread them out on the floor. She sprinkled them with water and let them sit in the warmth of the longhouse. Soon, the grains began to sprout. This was malting. It was a delicate process. If she let it go too long, the grains would spoil. If she stopped it too soon, the ale would be weak. When the sprouts were just right, she dried the grains over the fire. This arrested the growth and gave the malt a slightly smoky flavor. Today was brewing day. She had crushed the dried malt between two stones, a job that took all her strength. Now, she mixed the crushed malt with hot water from a large cauldron. This was the mash. She stirred it with a long wooden paddle, making sure the temperature was just right. This was a skill learned through years of practice, not from any written recipe. She judged the heat with her hand, the consistency with her eye. While the mash rested, she prepared the herbs. Hops were not commonly used in Scandinavia yet. Instead, she used a mix of what grew nearby. She had a small bag of dried meadow sweet, which gave the ale a sweet floral note. She added some yarrow for bitterness and a few sprigs of bog myrtle for aroma and its preservative qualities. These herbs were not just for flavor. They helped keep the ale from spoiling. After a few hours, she strained the sweet liquid, the wort, from the grain mash. The leftover grain wasn't wasted. It would be used to feed the pigs or to make a thin, watery porridge. The wort went back into the cauldron to be boiled with the herbs, the whole longhouse filled with the fragrant steam. Children would come by, curious. They knew brewing day meant a feast was coming. The final step was fermentation. She cooled the boiled wort and poured it into a large, clean, wooden fermenting tun. To this, she added a special ingredient, her yeast. It was a living thing, a culture passed down through generations. She kept it in a wooden stick, a yeast stick, which she would dip into the new batch. The yeast would wake up and begin to eat the sugars in the wort, turning them into alcohol. She would cover the tun with a cloth and leave it in a warm corner for a few days. The hissing and bubbling sound was the sound of ale coming to life. This was a respected skill. A woman who could brew well was a valuable part of the community. In sagas, serving ale is a constant theme. It is how a chieftain shows his generosity. It is how loyalty is built. To refuse a drink was an insult. To serve bad ale was a shame on the household. Archaeological finds support this. At the Firecat Viking fortress in Denmark, archaeologists found the remains of henbane. While poisonous in large amounts, in small quantities, it could have been used to make a strong, intoxicating ale for rituals. Residue analysis from drinking horns and pottery shows traces of barley, honey, and various herbs. Astrid's job was part chemistry, part cooking, part tradition. It was a physical job, hauling water and grain. It was a skilled job requiring patience and knowledge. She wasn't just making a beverage, she was creating the social glue that held her world together. When her husband and his men returned from a trading trip or a fishing expedition, it was her ale that they would drink as they told their stories by the fire. Her work was in every cup and every celebration. Number 15, the falconer was a hunter with a living weapon. An Ulf stood on a windswept hill in Jutland, Denmark, around the year 900. A leather glove protected his left arm. Perched on that glove was a gerfalcon, a large, powerful bird of prey. Its feathers were a mottled gray and white, its eyes sharp and focused. Ulf was a falconer. This was not a job for a poor farmer. It was a high-status profession, a pursuit of nobles and chieftains. His bird was a symbol of his master's power and wealth. His day didn't start with forging metal or planting seeds. It started with the care of his birds. He had several, housed in a special building called a mews. He checked each one for signs of illness. He cleaned their perches. He weighed them carefully. A falcon's weight was critical. A bird that was too heavy would be lazy and refuse to hunt. A bird that was too light would be weak. Finding the perfect hunting weight was an art. The training was long and difficult. It began with getting the wild-caught bird used to his presence. He would carry it on his fist for hours, day and night, until it was no longer afraid. He would teach it to step from the perch to his glove, to accept food from his hand. The most important part was training it to return. He would use a lure, a piece of leather baited with meat, which he would swing on a long cord. The falcon learned that returning to the lure meant a reward. Today he was hunting for his chieftain, Harold. They were looking for waterfowl near the coastal marshes. Ulf kept the falcon hooded. The small leather hood covered the bird's eyes, keeping it calm until it was time to hunt. When a flock of ducks rose from the reeds, Ulf's movements were swift and practiced. He removed the hood. The falcon's head swiveled, its eyes instantly locking onto the prey. With a flick of his wrist, Ulf cast the bird into the air. The gyrfalcon climbed high into the sky, a speck against the clouds. Then it folded its wings and stooped, diving at incredible speed. The hunt was a dramatic display of natural power guided by human training. The falcon struck one of the ducks, binding to it and bringing it to the ground. Ulf and his dogs then moved in to retrieve the kill and the falcon. The bird was rewarded with a small portion of the meat. This job was more than just providing food. It was entertainment. It was a sport. Chieftains and kings across Europe prized Norse falcons, especially the white gyrfalcons from Iceland and Greenland. They were valuable trade goods worth more than a horse. Exporting them was a lucrative business. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who met Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, noted their love of hunting with birds of prey. The evidence is not just in texts. The Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066, shows the English king Harold Godwinson carrying a hawk on his fist. The Normans were descended from Vikings, and they carried on this tradition. In high-status Viking graves, archaeologists have found the skeletons of birds of prey buried alongside their owners. In one grave at Birka, Sweden, a wealthy warrior was buried with his horse, his weapons, and his hawk. Ulf's skill was in his patience and his understanding of animal behavior. He had to be a naturalist, a veterinarian, and a trainer all in one. His job was a mix of quiet observation and moments of intense action. It was a world away from the chaos of a shield wall. He wasn't a warrior, he was a master of a living weapon, a provider of sport and status for the elite of his society. His hands were not calloused from an oar, but from the leather jesses of his bird. Number 14, the bead maker turned sand and ash into treasure. Ragna sat on a low stool in her workshop in Ribe, Denmark. The year was about 820 AD. Ribe was a bustling market town, one of the first in Scandinavia. Ragna was a bead maker. Her workshop was small and filled with the sharp smell of wood smoke. In front of her was a small clay furnace glowing with heat. Her job was to create beauty from simple materials. She made glass beads. These were not simple, single-color beads. Ragna specialized in millefiori, or thousand flowers beads. These were complex and colorful, highly prized by women for necklaces. They were a sign of wealth and status. Her work required immense skill and precision. Her process started with raw glass. Sometimes she imported blocks of it, called tesserae, from the south, perhaps from the remnants of the Roman Empire. But often she made her own. She would mix sand and soda ash in a crucible, a small clay pot, and heat it in her furnace until it melted into a thick, glowing liquid. To get different colors, she added metal oxides, copper for blue-green, iron for yellow or black, cobalt for a deep blue. The millefiori technique was the most difficult. She would first create long, thin rods of colored glass. Then she would bundle several of these rods together to create a pattern. For example, a central white rod surrounded by 6 red rods. She would heat this bundle until it was soft, and then pull it, stretching it out until it was a very thin cane, maybe only a few millimeters thick. The amazing part was that the pattern she created in the bundle remained intact, just miniaturized. Now came the real artistry. She would take a blob of molten base glass, say black, on the end of a metal rod. Then she would snip off tiny slices from her patterned cane and press them onto the hot base glass. She had to work quickly before the glass cooled. She would reheat the bead, rolling it on a smooth stone slab called a marver to make sure the patterned slices fused seamlessly into the surface. Finally, she would pierce a hole through the center before letting it cool slowly in a special annealing oven. If it cooled too fast, it would crack. Her hands were skilled and steady. A single mistake, a moment of inattention, could ruin a bead. Her workshop was filled with her tools, tongs, rods, cutters, and the crucibles that often cracked from the intense heat. Ribe was a center for this kind of work. Archaeologists there have excavated the remains of many workshops just like Ragnar's. They have found pits filled with broken crucibles, fragments of glass rods, and failed beads. These scraps are a clear record of a thriving industry. They show us the colors they used and the patterns they favored, checkerboards, waves, and starbursts. Her customers were the women of the town and those who came to the market. A merchant's wife might trade a handful of silver coins for a necklace of Ragnar's best work. A visiting trader might buy a large number of beads to sell in another town like Hedeby or Birka. Her beads traveled far. They have been found in graves all over the Viking world, from England to Russia. Ragnar was a specialist. She was an artisan. Her job required knowledge of chemistry, a steady hand, and an artistic eye. She was not a farmer's wife who did a bit of everything. She had a specific valuable craft. She was part of a new class of people emerging in these early towns, the professional craftsperson. She might not have sailed the seas, but the small, beautiful things she made did, becoming part of the vast network of Viking trade. Number 13, the fishermen fed the village. Bjarni pushed his small boat off the rocky shore. The cold morning mist of the fjord clung to the water. It was a day like any other, sometime in the late 9th century near a small settlement on the coast of Norway. Bjarni was a fisherman. This job was not glorious. It was a constant, grueling battle against the sea, but it was essential. Fish, especially cod and herring, was a staple of the Norse diet. His boat was a faring, a small open boat propelled by 2 pairs of oars. It was clinker built with overlapping planks, the same basic technology as the famous longships, but much smaller and more practical for 1 or 2 men. In the bottom of the boat lay his gear. He had long lines of twisted linen with hooks made from bone or iron. He had nets woven from nettle or hemp fibers with stone weights to sink them and wooden floats to hold them up. His main target today was cod. He rowed out to a spot he knew well, where the fjord deepened. He baited his hooks with mussels or smaller fish and dropped the line into the dark water. Then he waited. The waiting was a part of the job. He sat in the boat, feeling the rhythm of the swell, watching the gulls, listening to the water lap against the hull. The cold was a constant companion. He wore thick woolen clothes and a leather cloak, but the dampness always found a way in. The work was dangerous. A sudden squall could appear from behind the mountains, whipping the calm fjord into a dangerous chop. A larger boat could capsize his small vessel. The North Atlantic was unforgiving. Many fishermen left in the morning and never returned. The sea gave life, and it took life. When he felt a tug on the line, he pulled it in, hand over hand. The line was heavy, cutting into his wet, cold fingers. He brought a large, thrashing cod over the side of the boat. He killed it quickly with a wooden club and rebaited his hook. He would do this for hours until he had a decent catch. Back on shore, the work was not over. His wife Sigrid would be waiting. Some of the fish would be eaten fresh that day, but most of it had to be preserved for the winter. This was another crucial job. They would gut and clean the fish. Then they would either hang them on large wooden racks to air dry or salt them heavily in barrels. The dried cod, known as stockfish, became as hard as a board. It could last for years. It was a vital source of protein during the long, dark months when fresh food was scarce. It was also a major trade good. Norse traders sold stockfish all across Europe. The archaeological record is full of evidence of this life. At Viking Age coastal settlements, vast piles of fish bones are found, mostly cod and herring. This tells us what they were catching and eating. We find the tools of the trade iron fish hooks, stone net sinkers, and even fragments of nets preserved in waterlogged conditions. The sagas also speak of fishing. It is often a mundane backdrop to the stories of chieftains and warriors, a mention of men going out to fish, a dispute over fishing grounds. Bjarni's life was tied to the sea. He knew its moods, its dangers, and its bounty. He was not a raider who brought back silver. He was a provider who brought back food. His work was repetitive and perilous, but without him and thousands like him, the Viking Age, as we know it, could not have existed. The settlements would have starved, the ships would have had no provisions for their long voyages. He was a cornerstone of his society, his hands raw from the fishing line, his face weathered by the salt and wind. Number 12, the hunter and trapper lived on the edge of the world. Einar checked his line of snares as he moved silently through the pine forest. He was deep in the interior of Sweden, far from any major settlement, around the year 1000. Einar was a hunter and trapper. His job was to harvest the resources of the vast wild forest's meat for food and pelts for trade. He lived a life of solitude and self-reliance. He wore skis in the winter, allowing him to glide over the deep snow. In the summer, he walked, his knowledge of the landscape his most important tool. He knew the animal trails, the best places to find berries, the signs of changing weather. His home was a small, simple turf hut, little more than a temporary shelter against the elements. His work followed the seasons. In the autumn, he hunted elk and reindeer. He used a bow with iron-tipped arrows. A successful elk hunt was a major event. It provided a huge amount of meat, which he would smoke or dry to preserve it. The hide was used for clothing, shoes, and ropes. The antlers were a valuable raw material, used by craftsmen in the towns to make combs and other tools. Winter was the season for trapping. This was when the animal's fur was thickest and most valuable. He set snares for smaller animals like marten, fox, and squirrel. His most prized catch was the beaver. Beaver pelts were highly sought after for making warm, waterproof hats and cloaks. He also trapped bears, a dangerous but rewarding undertaking. A bear provided meat, a thick hide for a blanket, and fat that could be rendered into oil for lamps. He used a variety of traps, simple snares made of cord, deadfall traps that used a heavy log to crush an animal, and pit traps for larger game. He had to be skilled in woodcraft to build them and knowledgeable about animal behavior to place them effectively. He would check his trap lines every few days. Sometimes they were empty, sometimes they held a catch. Sometimes a wolverine or a wolf had gotten to his catch first. This was not just about survival, it was a business. Yeah, a few times a year, Einar would load a sled or a pack with his bundled furs and travel to a market town like Birka. There, he would trade his pelts for things he could not make himself: iron, tools, salt, pottery, and perhaps a small amount of silver. The furs he sold were part of a huge international trade network. Norse traders took these northern furs down the rivers of Russia to Constantinople and Baghdad, where they were exchanged for silk, spices, and silver coins. This life is reflected in the sagas and in archaeology. The Icelandic sagas mention hunters and the disputes that could arise over hunting rights. Place names often refer to animals like Bjorn, bear, or Ulf, wolf. In archaeological finds, we see the tools arrowheads, knives, and skinning tools. So we also find the products of this trade far from their source. A comb made of elk antler found in York, England, started its journey in a forest with a hunter like Einar. His job required immense patience and resilience. He spent long periods alone, facing the dangers of the wilderness predators, harsh weather, and the risk of injury, far from any help. He had to be an expert marksman, a skilled trapper, and a competent butcher and tanner. He was not part of the village hierarchy in the same way a farmer was. He lived on the fringes, a bridge between the settled world and the vast, untamed wilderness. His work was dirty and often brutal, but the goods he supplied were a luxury, driving the Viking economy and connecting his remote forests to the great cities of the world. Number 11, the weaver made the cloth that clothed everyone. Thora sat at her warp-weighted loom. It stood upright against the wall of the longhouse. The rhythmic clacking of her weaving sword, a long, flat piece of wood, filled the smoky air. It was a common sound in any Viking household. The year was around 970 on a farm in the Orkney Islands. Thora was a weaver. It was a job performed almost exclusively by women, and it was one of the most time-consuming and essential tasks in their society. Her work had begun months before, in the spring. She had helped shear the farm's sheep. The fleece was then cleaned and sorted. After that came the long process of spinning the wool into yarn. She used a simple drop spindle, a weighted stick that she would spin to twist the fibers together. She spent countless hours walking around the farm, her spindle in hand, constantly spinning. It took many, many hours of spinning to produce enough yarn for a single garment. She also made the dyes. She gathered plants from the surrounding landscape, wad for blue, madder root for red, and various lichens for yellows and browns. She would boil the yarn in large pots with the dyestuffs, carefully controlling the process to get the right shade. Some of the yarn she left undyed in the natural white, gray, or brown of the fleece. Now, at the loom, she was bringing it all together. The vertical threads, the warp, were stretched tight by a row of clay or stone loom weights at the bottom. She would pass the shuttle, carrying the horizontal thread, the weft, back and forth between the warp threads. Then she would use her weaving sword to beat the weft thread tightly into place. It was slow, methodical work. She could create surprisingly complex patterns. By lifting different combinations of warp threads, she could weave stripes, checks, and intricate diamond twills. For a wealthy client, she might even weave with silk threads imported from the East, creating a luxurious border on a woolen tunic. Cloth was a form of wealth. It was used for clothing, for sails on the longships, for blankets, and for shrouds to bury the dead. A ship's sail, a huge piece of woolen cloth, represented an enormous investment of labor. It could take 2 women a full year to spin and weave enough cloth for one sail. The quality of a woman's weaving was a source of pride and a measure of the household's prosperity. The tools of her trade are some of the most common artifacts found at Viking sites. Archaeologists find spindle whorls made of soapstone or bone, the small flywheels that gave the spindle its spin. They find the clay and stone loom weights in lines on the floors of excavated longhouses, right where the loom once stood. They find weaving swords, often made of bone or whalebone, and smaller bone needles for sewing the finished cloth. In the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated to around 834, 2 high-status women were buried with a vast array of textiles and weaving equipment, including a complete loom. This shows the high value placed on this craft. The sagas also describe women at their looms. In Ingjald's saga, there is a famous, grim scene where supernatural women are seen weaving with men's entrails as thread and severed heads as loom weights, chanting a poem about an upcoming battle. This connects weaving not just to domestic life, but to fate and destiny. Thora's work was essential. Without it, her family would have no clothes to protect them from the harsh northern climate. The sailors would have no sails to catch the wind. Her job was not just a craft, it was a fundamental technology. It was physically demanding, requiring strength in her arms and back to beat the weft. It was skilled, requiring a good eye for color and pattern. Her world was not the battlefield, but the longhouse. Her creation was not a sword, but the fabric of her society. Number 10, the shipbuilder was the master of wood and sea. Sven wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He stood back to look at the skeleton of the ship rising from the shore of the Roskilde fjord in Denmark. The year was about 1070. Sven was a shipbuilder, a skipasmeter. This was one of the most respected and skilled professions in the Norse world. The ship was everything. It was transportation, a trading vessel, a war machine, and a status symbol. To build one was to be a master of engineering and art. He was not just a simple carpenter, he was a specialist. He knew the forest as well as he knew the sea. His work began by selecting the right trees. For the keel, the backbone of the ship, he needed a single, long, straight oak tree. For the planks of the hull, he needed tall oaks that he could split into long, flexible boards. He didn't saw the logs into planks. He split them with wedges following the grain of the wood. This made the planks incredibly strong and supple, a key secret to the success of Viking ship design. His tools were simple but effective. He used a broad axe to shape the timbers, his eye guiding every cut. He used adzes for finer shaping, chisels for cutting joints, and augers for drilling holes for the rivets. The sound of his axe and hammer echoed across the fjord. He led a team of men, each with their own task. Some were felling trees, others were splitting logs, and some were forging the thousands of iron rivets that would hold the ship together. The construction method was clinker-built. He laid the keel first, then he attached the strakes, the long planks of the hull, one by one. Each strake overlapped the one below it, like shingles on a roof. This is what gave the ships their characteristic look. He fastened the overlapping planks together with iron rivets. He would push the rivet through a drilled hole from the outside, and his apprentice, on the inside, would place a small iron washer, a rove, over the end and hammer it flat. This created a strong permanent bond. To make the hull waterproof, they would stuff the seams between the planks with tarred animal hair or wool. This was called caulking. It was a messy but vital job. The frame of the ship, the ribs, was often attached last. They were shaped from naturally curved timbers and tied to the hull planks with ropes made from tree roots. This gave the ship incredible flexibility. It could twist and bend with the waves of the open ocean rather than breaking. Sven was building a merchant ship, a nar. It was wider and deeper than a longship, designed to carry cargo like wool, timber, or dried fish. It had a small crew and relied mostly on its single large square sail. He also knew how to build the sleeker, faster longships designed for war and raiding. The principles were the same, but the proportions were different. The evidence for his work is stunning. In Roskilde, where Sven worked, archaeologists in 1962 found a blockade of 5 deliberately sunk Viking ships at a place called Skuldelev. The ships, now in the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, show the range of his craft. There is a great longship, a smaller warship, a nar, and a small fishing boat. They are a library of Viking naval architecture. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, found in burial mounds in Norway, are even more perfectly preserved. We can see the tool marks on the wood, the intricate carvings on the prow, the skill of the builder in every joint. Sven's job was the pinnacle of woodworking. It required a deep, intuitive understanding of materials. He did not work from written plans or blueprints. He worked from knowledge passed down through generations. He knew how a piece of wood would behave, how to shape it to achieve both strength and beauty. He created the vessels that defined his age. Without his skill, there would be no long-distance trade, no settlement of Iceland, no voyages to North America. He was an engineer, an artist, and the creator of the machine that powered the Viking world. Number 9, the farmer was the heart of the homeland. Olaf leaned on his spade and looked out over his fields. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. His farm was in the valley of Gudbrandsdalen in Norway, a fertile region inland from the fjords. The year was around 920. Olaf was a farmer, a bondi. This was the most common job in the Viking world. The vast majority of people were farmers. The entire society, from the chieftain to the raider, was built on the foundation of the farm. His life was governed by the seasons. Spring was a time of frantic activity. The snows had melted, and the ground was ready to be worked. He used a simple plow, an ard, pulled by a pair of oxen, to break up the soil in his small fields. His wife and children followed behind, breaking up clumps of earth with hoes and planting the seeds. They grew barley, oats, and rye. These grains were hardy and could survive the short northern growing season. They also had a small vegetable garden near the longhouse, growing cabbages, beans, and onions. Summer was a time of tending. He had to weed the fields. He had to watch over his livestock. His wealth was not just in his land, but in his animals. He had a few dairy cows for milk, butter, and cheese. He had a flock of sheep for wool and meat. He had pigs that foraged in the nearby woods. And he had chickens for eggs. He and his sons would take the animals up to higher summer pastures in the mountains, a practice called setter drift. This allowed the fields near the farm to be saved for growing hay. Late summer was the harvest, the most critical time of the year. Everyone worked from sunrise to sunset. They cut the grain with iron sickles. They gathered hay for winter fodder. A good harvest meant they would eat well through the winter. A bad harvest, due to drought or too much rain, could mean starvation. Autumn was a time of preparation. He slaughtered the animals that would not be kept over the winter. The meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. He repaired the turf and timber buildings of his farmstead, making sure they were ready for the heavy snows. He brought the animals back from the summer pastures and into the byre, which was often attached to the longhouse. The body heat of the animals helped to warm the human living quarters. Winter was a long, dark, and cold season. Much of the time was spent indoors. Olaf would spend his days repairing tools, carving wooden bowls, and telling stories with his family around the central fire. His wife would be busy spinning wool and weaving cloth, but the outdoor work never completely stopped, and he had to feed and water the animals in the byre every day. He had to chop wood for the fire. The farm was a self-sufficient unit. Olaf was a farmer, but he was also a carpenter, a veterinarian, and a manager. His farmstead consisted of several buildings, the main longhouse where his family and servants lived, a byre for the animals, a smithy for metalwork, a storehouse for grain, and perhaps a bathhouse. Archaeological excavations of Viking farms, like the one at Vorbasse in Denmark, show these clusters of buildings, revealing a complex and well-organized agricultural life. But Olaf was a free man. He owned his land. This gave him status in the community. As a landowner, he had the right to attend the local assembly, the Thing, to vote on laws and settle disputes. If he was prosperous, he might even be a local chieftain, but his life was one of hard physical labor. His hands were calloused from the plow and the axe. His back was strong from a lifetime of lifting. He was not a Viking in a horned helmet. He was the man who made the Viking Age possible, his life tied to the soil and the rhythm of the seasons. Number 8. The blacksmith forged the tools of life and death. Sturkar hammered the glowing piece of iron on his anvil. Sparks flew in the dim light of his smithy. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal was a familiar sound in his village in the Swedish region of Uppland. It was around 990 AD. Sturkar was a blacksmith. His job was to transform raw iron into the essential tools and weapons that his society depended on. He was part craftsman, part magician in the eyes of many. His smithy was a small, dark building, usually set a little apart from the other houses because of the fire risk. The heart of it was the forge, a stone-lined hearth where he heated the iron. A pair of bellows, which his young apprentice pumped, forced air into the charcoal fire, making it burn intensely hot. His most important tool was his anvil, a heavy block of iron set into a large log. Around it were his hammers, tongs, and chisels of various sizes. His day started with making charcoal, a slow process of burning wood in a low-oxygen environment. Good charcoal was key to getting the fire hot enough. Then he would take a bloom of raw iron. This iron was not pure. It had been smelted from bog iron, a common source in Scandinavia, in a separate furnace. The bloom was a spongy mass of iron mixed with slag, a glassy waste product. Sturkar's first task was to heat and hammer this bloom repeatedly. This was called consolidation. Each blow of the hammer squeezed out more of the liquid slag and welded the iron particles together into a solid bar. It was hot, smoky, and strenuous work. From these bars of iron, he could make anything. A farmer might come to him for a new plowshare, an axe head, or a sickle. A woman would need new knives for the kitchen, or a needle for sewing. A builder would need nails and hinges. Stirkar could make all of these. He understood the properties of the metal. He knew how to shape it, how to harden it by quenching it in water, and how to temper it to make it less brittle. But his most high-status work was making weapons. A chieftain would commission a sword. This was the ultimate test of a smith's skill. A good sword needed to have a hard edge that would stay sharp, but a soft, flexible core that would not break in battle. To achieve this, Stirkar used a technique called pattern welding. He would take several bars of iron with different properties, twist them together, and forge weld them into a single blade. When the finished blade was polished and etched, it would reveal a beautiful, watery pattern on the surface. This was a sign of a master smith. The job was respected, but also seen as mysterious. The ability to control fire and transform rock into shining metal was powerful. Smithing had a strong connection to Norse mythology. The dwarves were the master smiths who created treasures for the gods, like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Wayland the Smith is a famous figure in Germanic legend, a magical craftsman who could create incredible things. This mythology added to the aura of a real-life smith like Stirkar. Archaeological finds confirm the importance of this work. The smiths' graves are often found with their tools, hammers, tongs, and files buried with them. We find the products of their forges everywhere, from simple nails to magnificent swords like those found at Hedeby. Slag from ironworking is a common find at settlement sites, showing that many communities had their own smith. For Stirkar was a vital part of his community. He was the local technologist. He made the tools that allowed farmers to grow food, builders to construct houses, and warriors to fight. His work was physically demanding and required years of apprenticeship to master. He was a creator, shaping the very fabric of his world with fire and iron. Number 7, the merchant was a master of risk and reward. Runolf adjusted the tiller of his Nar as it sailed south through the Baltic Sea. The single square sail was full of wind. The hold of his ship was packed with goods, walrus ivory and ropes from the north, amber from the Baltic coast, and fine furs from the Swedish forests. The year was 1015. Runolf was a merchant, a kaupmaður. His job was to travel, trade, and connect the different parts of the Viking world and beyond. His life was one of constant movement and calculation. He spent months of the year at sea or in foreign market towns. He had to be a skilled sailor, able to navigate by the sun, the stars, and his knowledge of coastlines. He had to be a shrewd businessman, able to haggle in different languages and understand the value of goods in different markets. His home base was the island of Gotland, a major trading hub. From there, he might sail west to Hedeby in Denmark, a massive trade center where he could trade his northern goods for Frankish wine, glass, and pottery. Or he might sail east across the Baltic and up the rivers of what is now Russia. This eastern route was long and dangerous. He would have to haul his ship overland between river systems, a process called portage, but the rewards were great. He could reach the great cities of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, or even Baghdad. In the east, his furs and amber were in high demand. In return, he would acquire silk, spices, and, most importantly, silver. The Arab dirham was the international currency of the age. Hordes of thousands of these silver coins have been found all over Scandinavia, a testament to the scale of this trade. Runolf would carry his silver in a small leather pouch, but he also used a set of folding bronze scales to weigh it. Transactions were often done by weight, not by coin count. His job was full of risks. The sea was always a danger. Storms could sink a ship, destroying his cargo and his life. Pirates were another threat. He and his small crew were armed, but they preferred to avoid conflict. A merchant ship was built for cargo, not for speed or battle. There was also the risk of being cheated in a foreign land or of having goods seized by a local ruler. But Runolf was part of a network. He had business partners in different towns. He might enter into a falag, a formal partnership with other men to finance a voyage. They would pool their money to buy a ship and cargo, and then share the profits or the losses. This spread the risk. These partnerships were built on trust and sealed with oaths. The evidence for this trading life is immense. The trading towns themselves, like Birka, Hedeby, and Ribe, are a treasure trove for archaeologists. Excavations reveal workshops, warehouses, and jetties. They uncover goods from all over the known world: cowrie shells from the Red Sea, a small bronze Buddha statue from India, silk from China. These objects tell the story of long-distance connections. Runestones also tell this story. The Galtaland stone that mourned Bjor was one of many. Others commemorate merchants who died abroad. One stone in Sweden was raised in memory of a man who sailed to the west and to the east, a simple summary of a merchant's life. Runolf was not a raider looking for plunder. He was a businessman engaged in peaceful, if risky, commerce. He was a vital link, bringing new goods, ideas, and wealth into his homeland. He helped to build the towns and create a more complex, interconnected society. His world was the open sea and the bustling marketplace, his success measured not in glory, but in the weight of silver in his purse. Number 6. The runecarver wrote the stories in stone. Grim sat by a large, flat slab of granite he had chosen from the hillside. In his hand, he held a hammer and a sharply pointed iron chisel. He was carefully chipping away at the stone, following the lines he had drawn on the surface with charcoal. The year was about 1050, in the area around Lake Malaren in Sweden. Grim was a runecarver, a runerister. His job was to create permanent memorials, to carve the stories and names of his people into the very landscape. He was a highly specialized craftsman. He was literate, one of the few people in his community who could read and write the runic alphabet, the Futhark. But his skill went beyond just knowing the letters. He was also an artist. He could create beautiful, intricate designs, often featuring the looping, ribbon-like bodies of mythical beasts that intertwined with the bands of text. His client was a wealthy widow named Inga. Her husband, Alric, had recently died. She wanted a stone to honor his memory and to mark the boundary of the land he had owned. Grim had discussed the design and the text with her. The inscription would be simple. Inga had this stone raised in memory of Alric, her husband. He was a good farmer and owned this land. The work was slow and physically demanding. He had to first prepare the surface of the stone, making it smooth enough to carve. Then he would lay out the design. The text usually followed the curves of the animal's body, a style known as the runestone style. His carving had to be precise. A slip of the chisel could ruin a letter or a part of the design. He worked for weeks on this single stone. Once the carving was finished, he would paint it. He used natural pigments, red ochre, for the runes to make them stand out, and perhaps black, white, or blue to color the animal designs. The original runestones were not the bare gray stone we see today. They were vibrant, colorful monuments. Grim's name was known in the region. He was a professional. Like a modern artist, he often signed his work. Many runestones in Sweden bear the name of the carver. Men like Opir or Asmund, this tells us that they were proud of their craft and that their skill was recognized and valued. Some carvers seem to have had workshops and apprentices, and their distinctive styles can be traced across dozens of stones in a particular region. Runestones were not tombstones. They were not usually placed at graves. They were memorials placed by roadsides, at bridges, or at the local assembly place. They were public statements. They declared land ownership, commemorated a family member, or honored someone who had died on a voyage. They were a way for powerful families to display their status and record their history for all to see. Over 3,000 runestones have been found, the vast majority in Sweden. They are a unique historical source. They give us the names of ordinary people, not just kings and jarls. They tell us about family relationships, property, and travel. We learn about men who died in England, in Greece, serving the Byzantine emperor, or on the trade routes to the east. They are a direct voice from the past. Grim's job was to give that voice a permanent form. He was a historian, an artist, and a stonemason. He dealt in memory. The stones he carved would outlast the wooden longhouses and the people who lived in them. His work was a bridge across time, ensuring that the names of people like Alric and Inga would not be forgotten. He was not just chipping away at a rock, he was carving a piece of history. Number 5, the Gothi was a chieftain and a priest. Thord sat on the high seat in his longhouse. Before him stood 2 farmers from the valley, arguing over the ownership of a dozen sheep. It was the year 960 in western Iceland. Thord was a Gothi. This was a complex and powerful role in the pagan Norse world. He was not just a priest, he was also a chieftain, a lawmaker, and a judge. His religious duties were important. The Norse gods, the Aesir, were not worshipped in large temples by a professional clergy. Religion was a part of daily life, centered on the farm and the community. Thord's role was to lead the major seasonal festivals called Blot. These were communal feasts held to ensure good harvests, fertility, or victory in conflict. At these events, he would oversee the ritual slaughter of an animal, like a horse or a pig. The blood would be sprinkled on the altar, and the participants and the meat would be cooked and shared in a great feast. He was the intermediary between his community and the gods. His longhouse might have a separate room or building, a hof, for these rituals. Archaeological evidence for dedicated temples is scarce, suggesting that these ceremonies often took place at the chieftain's own farm. Thord maintained the holy site, which might include wooden carvings of the gods like Thor, Odin, and Freyr, but his political and legal power was just as important. In Iceland's unique society, which had no king, power was decentralized. The country was organized around chieftains like Thord. The farmers in his district, his Gothord, were his followers, his thingmen. They were free men who had pledged their allegiance to him. In return, he provided them with protection and represented them at the regional and national assemblies. The argument over the sheep was a typical example of his daily work. He had to listen to both sides, consult with other wise men, and make a judgment based on the law and local custom. His authority depended on his reputation for fairness and wisdom. If he made poor judgments or was seen as weak, his thingmen could simply choose to follow another Gothi. Once a year, Thord would travel to the Althing, the National Assembly of Iceland held at Thingvellir. This was a 2-week-long event where all the Gothar from across the country met. They would make new laws, settle major disputes, and arrange political alliances. Thord's role here was crucial. He was a member of the Logretta, the legislative council that was the heart of the Althing. He was a lawmaker for the entire nation. The title Gothi was a piece of property. It could be inherited, bought, or sold. A man was not born a Gothi, he became one by owning the title. This made the position a source of political maneuvering and sometimes violent conflict, as depicted in many of the Icelandic sagas. Characters like Snorri Gothi in Erbingja Saga or Injal's friend Gunnar in Injal's Saga are powerful chieftains who navigate this complex social landscape. Thord's job was to be the leader of his community in every sense. He was its spiritual guide, its political representative, and its legal authority. He had to be a skilled orator, a shrewd politician, and a respected judge. He was not a remote figure. He was a working farmer and landowner, just a more powerful one than his neighbors. His power came not from divine right, but from the consent and loyalty of the free farmers who followed him. He was the glue that held the decentralized Icelandic Commonwealth together. Number 4, the healer used herbs, chants, and common sense. Solveig knelt beside a young man who had a deep, ugly cut on his leg from an axe. The wound was red and swollen. She had been called to his farm because she was known as a healer, a Leiknir. It was the late 10th century in a village in Norway. Her job was to tend to the sick and injured using a combination of plant lore, practical skill, and ritual. Her medical kit was not in a bag, but in her head and in the landscape around her. She knew the properties of the local plants. She had gathered yarrow, which was known to help stop bleeding. She had dried chamomile to make a soothing tea for fevers. She knew that the willow tree's bark could ease pain, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. For the young man's wound, her first step was practical. She carefully cleaned it with warm water and a clean linen cloth. She examined it closely, looking for dirt or splinters of wood. She knew that a clean wound was less likely to fester. Then she made a poultice. She crushed some herbs with antiseptic properties, perhaps wild garlic or onion, and mixed them with a little honey, which also helps prevent infection. She applied this to the wound and then bound it tightly with fresh linen strips. But her work was not just physical. The Norse people believed that illness and injury could also have supernatural causes, like the work of evil spirits or elves. So, her healing often included a ritual element. As she bound the wound, she might chant a galdur, a magical incantation, to drive away the spirits of sickness and speed the healing. These chants were often poetic and alliterative, passed down through generations of healers. The Poetic Edda contains a poem, Havamal, where Odin speaks of the magical charms he knows. One of them is for healing. I know a 10th sill spell. If I see hedge riders sailing through the air, I can cast a spell so that they go astray. This shows the deep connection between healing and the supernatural world. Surgery was also practiced. Healers, like Solveig, would have been able to set broken bones using wooden splints and tight bandages. They could lance boils and stitch wounds. Skeletons from the Viking Age show evidence of healed fractures, some of which are well set, indicating skilled treatment. There is even a skull from Gotland, Sweden, that shows evidence of trepanation, a surgical procedure where a hole is drilled into the skull, which the patient survived. The women were often the primary healers within a community. They were the keepers of herbal knowledge and tended to the health of their families. However, there were also male healers. In the Icelandic sagas, some men are noted for their medical skills. The job was based on experience and observation. Solveig had learned her craft from her mother or another older woman in the village. She had learned by watching, by trying, and by remembering what worked. There were no medical schools or textbooks. Her knowledge was a practical folk tradition. She was a respected figure. Life was hard and injuries were common. A skilled healer could mean the difference between life and death. Her payment might be in food, cloth, or a small piece of silver. But her real reward was the status and gratitude of her community. She was not a warrior or a chieftain, but her role was just as vital. She fought a different kind of battle against pain, infection, and death. Number 3, the comb maker was a master of bone and antler. Olaf worked in a small, cluttered workshop in the town of Jorvik, the Viking name for York, England. The year was around 950. The floor of his shop was covered in shavings and dust. The air smelled of sawn antler. Olaf was a comb maker. This may seem like a humble trade, but it was a booming industry. Combs were not just for grooming. They were essential personal items, and Olaf was a specialist who produced them in large numbers. His primary raw material was red deer antler. It was strong, flexible, and could be carved and polished to a beautiful finish. He would get his raw antlers from hunters or traders. It was a valuable commodity. His process involved several steps, each requiring specific tools and skills. First, he would cut the main beam of the antler into flat plates. This was hard work, done with a small iron-toothed saw. Then he would smooth these plates and cut them into the basic rectangular shape of the comb's connecting plate. Next, he had to make the tooth plates. He would cut smaller sections of antler and then slice them very thinly. These thin slices would become the teeth. This was the most delicate part of the job. He had to saw a series of fine, parallel cuts into each tooth plate. The spacing had to be even. A special double-bladed saw might have been used for this task. The assembly was ingenious. He would sandwich the tooth plates between two decorated connecting plates. He would drill holes through all the layers and then rivet them together with small pins made of iron or bronze. After assembly, he would saw the individual teeth apart and then spend a long time filing and polishing the finished comb until it was smooth and comfortable to use. Many combs were decorated. Olaf would use a small knife to incise patterns onto the connecting plates. Common designs were simple geometric patterns like ring and dot motifs, zigzags, or cross-hatching. These designs were not just for beauty, they were the mark of his workshop. Combs were everywhere in the Viking world. They are one of the most common artifacts found in Viking graves and settlements. At Jorvik alone, archaeologists have excavated hundreds of combs and the waste material from their manufacture. The sheer volume of antler shavings, half-finished combs, and discarded pieces shows that this was a full-time specialized industry with many workshops like Olaf's. It was mass production Viking style. Why were combs so important? They were vital for personal hygiene, for keeping hair tidy, and for removing lice. But they were also a status symbol. A finely made and decorated comb was a personal possession that showed a person cared about their appearance. Both men and women used them. Viking men were often noted in contemporary accounts for being surprisingly well-groomed. Olaf's job was not glamorous, it was dusty, repetitive work, but he was a skilled artisan, part of the bustling urban economy of a major trading town. He was not a farmer who made a few things on the side. He was a professional who made his living with a specific craft. He would sell his combs in the local market. Merchants might buy them in bulk to trade in other towns or overseas. A comb made in Jorvik could end up in Ireland or Scandinavia. Olaf's life was very different from that of a raider or a farmer. He lived in a crowded, noisy, and smelly town. His daily rhythm was not dictated by the seasons, but by the demand for his products. He was a small businessman, a producer of a mundane but essential item. His work gives us a glimpse into the everyday lives of the people of the Viking Age, their concern for their appearance, and the rise of urban industry. Number 2, the law speaker was a living library. Every summer, a man named Thorgeir traveled for 2 weeks on horseback from his farm at Losjevatn in northern Iceland. His destination was Thingvellir, a dramatic plain of volcanic rock and fissures. There, the Althing, the national parliament of Iceland, was held. The year was 1000. Thorgeir held the most important office in the Icelandic Commonwealth. He was the law speaker, the Lagsagumadr. His job was unique. He was the keeper of the law. In an age before widespread literacy and law books, the entire legal code of Iceland was stored in one place, his memory. For the 3 years of his term in office, it was his duty to recite 1/3 of the law code aloud each year from the Logberg, the law rock, so that all assembled at the Althing could hear it. He was a human hard drive. He had to have a perfect word-for-word memory of every law. The laws covered everything from inheritance rights and land boundaries to the punishment for theft and murder. If there was a dispute about what the law said, the law speaker's version was the final authority. He was the ultimate legal reference. But he did more than just recite. He also presided over the Logretta, the legislative body of the Althing. He helped to set the agenda and would advise the chieftains, the Gothar, on legal matters. He did not have the power to make laws himself, but his knowledge and influence were immense. He was chosen for his wisdom, his good memory, and his reputation for being impartial. Thorgeir's most famous moment came in the year 1000. Iceland was facing a religious crisis. Some Icelanders had converted to Christianity, while the majority still followed the old pagan gods. The two factions were on the verge of civil war at the Althing. To avert disaster, both sides agreed to let Thorgeir, who was himself a pagan, make the final decision. This was the ultimate test of his role. He had to find a legal solution that would hold the country together. According to the sagas, Thorgeir went to his tent and lay down under a cloak for a full day and night, thinking. He was not praying or seeking a divine vision. He was considering the legal and social consequences of every possible option. When he emerged, he went to the Law Rock. He declared his decision. Iceland would officially become a Christian country. All people should be baptized. However, in a brilliant compromise, he decreed that people could still practice the old religion in private. Exposing newborn infants and eating horse meat, both pagan customs, would still be allowed for the time being. His decision was accepted by both sides. Civil war was avoided. This story illustrates the power and nature of his job. It was not a position of command like a king. It was a position of authority based on knowledge and trust. He was the supreme legal expert, and his job was to preserve the social order through the application of the law. The role of law speaker existed in other parts of the Norse world, like Norway and Sweden, but it was most developed in the unique political system of Iceland. The man who held the office was usually a respected chieftain, but his power as law speaker was separate from his power as a Gothi. It was a national office, not a local one. Thorgeir's job was entirely intellectual. It required a phenomenal memory and a deep understanding of legal principles. He was not a warrior. His weapon was his words. His work shows a side of Viking society that is often overlooked, a deep respect for law, order, and the power of reasoned argument. Number 1, the Skald was a poet, a historian, and a critic. Egil Skallagrimsson stood in the hall of King Eric Bloodaxe in York. He had been captured, and the king, his sworn enemy, intended to execute him the next morning. Egil had one night to save his own life. He was a fierce warrior and a farmer, but his most powerful weapon was not his sword. It was his mind. Egil was a skald, a court poet. His job was to compose and perform poetry. During that one night around the year 948, he composed a magnificent poem of praise for King Eirik. It was called Hofudlausen, or Head Ransom. The next morning he performed it in the king's hall. The poem was a masterpiece of the complex skaldic style. It used intricate meters, strict rhyme schemes, and elaborate metaphors called kennings. For example, instead of saying warrior, he might say feeder of ravens. Instead of sea, he might say whale road. The poem was so technically brilliant and so flattering to the king that Eric, despite his hatred for Egil, had no choice but to grant him his life. The story told in Egil's saga perfectly illustrates the power and the high-stakes nature of being a skald. A skald's job was not just to entertain. He was a professional attached to the court of a king or a jarl. His primary role was to compose poems of praise for his patron. These poems, called Draper, were not just flattery. They were a historical record. They recorded the patron's great deeds, his victories in battle, his generosity to his followers. In a society without written histories, the skald's poetry was the way a ruler's fame was preserved and broadcast. A good poem ensured a leader's name would live on after his death. The job required immense skill and training. The rules of skaldic poetry were incredibly rigid. A skald had to master the complex meters and the vast vocabulary of kennings and another poetic device called a hiti, a poetic synonym. This was not folk poetry. It was a high art form, and its practitioners were elite intellectuals. It was also a lucrative career. A successful skald could expect to be rewarded handsomely by his patron. Gifts of gold arm rings, fine weapons, and land were common. The Icelandic skalds were particularly famous and sought after. They traveled to the courts of Norway, Denmark, and even England to serve powerful rulers. But the job was also dangerous. A skald had to be a good diplomat and read the mood of the court. He could also compose poems of insult or satire called nid. These were powerful weapons. A well-crafted insult could ruin a man's reputation, but composing such a poem against a powerful man could easily get the skald killed. The skald walked a fine line between praise and criticism, his words his only defense. We know the names of over 200 skalds, and fragments of their work are preserved, mostly as quotations in the later Icelandic sagas. Historians value these poems because they are contemporary sources composed by eyewitnesses to the events they describe. A poem about a battle in the 10th century is a more direct piece of evidence than a saga written about that battle 200 years later. Egil's life shows the dual nature of the Viking ideal. He was a brutal, violent warrior. But he was also a sensitive, highly intelligent poet capable of composing poems of great beauty and emotional depth. His job as a skald was not a hobby. It was a profession that required a razor-sharp intellect, a phenomenal memory, and incredible courage. The skald was the press officer, the historian, and the media star of the Viking Age, all rolled into one. His job was to craft the story, to shape the fame of the great men of his time, and sometimes to save his own neck.